My name is Kareem Estefan. I'm a recent graduate of this program, and I'm honored, although slightly saddened, to channel David Levi Strauss tonight. He has a back injury that prevented him from being here this evening, but wishes that he could be here to introduce the marvelous Anne Lauterbach, also one of my dear teachers from this program. And so he has written a short introduction to Anne's work, which I'll read for him tonight. When I was young, I went to the poets to get the news, to get the most informative, insightful, and necessary perspectives on what was going on, based on a thorough knowledge of what had come before. And it turned out that was the right thing to do. The poets, the best poets, and I sought them out early on, had the goods. They found the best sources in a wide variety of disciplines before anyone else, and they got the news first. Things have changed a little, even in my short lifetime, but some poets still have the ability to bring the news, and Anne Lauterbach is one of those poets. Poetry, to her, is not just a matter of self-expression or a display of linguistic mastery. It is an actual making, so it encompasses world-making, and that means meaning-making. It has to do with the world as it is, and as we make it, at large and in particular. Part of this having to do with the world in Lauterbach's work from the beginning has been seeing and thinking about art, and about how art happens. She has added a great deal to this inquiry and knowledge in the essays collected in The Night Sky, and also in the little book that resulted from her last lecture for us, The Given and the Chosen, as well as in a host of other writings on art and artists. Tonight, her subject is Phantom Limb, in search of how meanings are made. Please welcome Anne Lauterbach.
Thank you, Kareem, AKA Levi. You don't quite have the same shape. And thank you all for coming. I know this is New York City, where I no longer live, and I know that on any given night there are many competitive events, so I'm very honored that you're here, although I'm a little upset that Levi imagines that I'm going to bring you any news. I don't think I have much news to impart. I'm going to give a talk that is, in my view, not finished, and therefore does what I often do when things aren't finished. It kind of meanders. It's a meandery kind of a talk. I'm hoping that when I look up from time to time, you're not asleep. Even though it's very, very hot. And I may have to remove some garments in order for me to stay here. So yeah, I got myself into this subject matter, and now I'm going to try and get myself out of this subject matter. Don't you like preludes? I sort of feel like I just want to stay here in the prelude. But I'm going to begin this somewhat meandering meditation with three quotations that variously animate some of the ideas I will touch on. The first is from Daniel Heller Rosen's book, The Inner Touch, Archaeology of a Sensation. He's speaking about Aristotle. The sensitive soul in the classical doctrine encountered nothing if not by contact, and the terrain of the tactile body remained everywhere as wide and as varied as that of aesthesis itself. Where in such a world to set the bounds beyond which touch cannot venture, the limits at which sense grows dull, obliged to relinquish its rights to the more subtle powers, desire and movement, imagination, memory, and intellection. In the age of the domination of the knowing being, the question is a pressing one. but it appears not to have occurred to the ancient philosopher. Thoughtful or thoughtless, conscious or not, the life of the animal, in his eyes, remained a matter of tact before all else. Tact, touch, tact. The second is from Marilyn Robinson, from Absence of Mind, the chapter Thinking Again. Our religious traditions give us, as the name of God, two deeply mysterious words, one deeply mysterious utterance, I am. Putting to one side the question of their meaning as the name and character by which the God of Moses would be known, these are words any human being can say about herself, and does say, though always with a modifier of some kind. I am hungry, I am comfortable, I am a singer, I am a cook. The abrupt descent into particularity in every statement of this kind, being itself made an auxiliary to some momentary accident of being, may only startle in the dark of night when the intuition comes that there is no proportion between the great givens of existence and the narrow vessel of circumstances into which it is invariably forced. Finally, Gayatri Spivak, from her monumental book, An Aesthetic Education in the Era of Globalization. Globalization can never happen to the sensory equipment of the experiencing being, except insofar as it is always implicit in its vanishing outlines. Only an aesthetic education can continue to prepare us for this, thinking an uneven and only apparently accessible contemporaneity that can no longer be interpreted by such nice polarities as modernity, tradition, colonial, post-colonial. Everything else begins there, in that space that allows us to survive in the singular and the unverifiable, surrounded by the lethal and lugubrious consolations of rational choice. Globalization is an island of languaging in a field of traces. So that's my little company. You're looking very austere. Okay, it's in parts. I like to do things in parts. These are parts. First part is I and the death of the author. Is the sound okay? There is an ensemble of dyadic couplets that circulate among those of us who want to make certain alignments, or at least certain relations between ideas of art making and ideas that have direct bearing on how we think and act in the world. One such alignment might be between aesthetics and politics. Another might be between theory and practice. Another between thinking and doing, conception and perception, the imagined and the real, bodies and technologies, self and other. I guess I am tonight suggesting another such coupling, intention and meaning, to words frequently in use that seem simultaneously clear and vague. As we all know, we have entered a phase in which the relation between ourselves as living creatures and the technologies we have invented to augment our various engagements, our needs and connections are ambiguous and perplexing. We are not, some of us, sure whether they will finally help or hinder our life, singular and plural, or the life of the earth which sustains us. Neither intent nor meaning is evident. These dynamic word dyads have a long history in critical, imaginative, and philosophical thinking and writing, one that goes back in the Western tradition invariably to the Greeks. to Plato's Republic and to Aristotle's De Anima, just for starters. I suppose they continue to thrive and to vex because we live in language, and language keeps asking us to know how to make meaning, to know how meaning is made. In the beginning was the word. We're a logocentric species. How do I know what I think until I see what I say? That cute phrase by E.M. Foster came into my life decades ago, giving me a sense that writing was a way of discovering rather than simply of presenting or positing something known. It was a little talismanic scrap of linguistic code, a sign or indication of how to proceed. It made the place of intention somewhat mysterious and gave the very act of writing its own potential to reveal. Well, we shall see. I'm confronted this evening with the incertitude of my own hubris, imagining that somehow I can wrestle the Goliath meaning into a modest talk on a street in Chelsea. I have no expertise, I cannot bring you the news. The best I can do is to say that it's a subject that interests me, and then I shall try to demonstrate that interest. I'm not sure how the notion of intention came into my purview. I know that I have some personal issues with gaps between intention and action. I say I will do something and then I don't do it, or I do it late in the nick of time. I seem, despite myself, to want to occupy an enjambment, to find myself in a negative or even a perverse energy of resisting, as if such delays could somehow thwart the passage of time. It's an absurd idea, but there's some peculiar temporal snag that seems to want to convert into a field of open possibilities, which in turn will provide a way to act without being constrained by absolute relations. It's as if I'm always wanting to subvert the causal chain, almost at the level of syntax, to deprive the subject of its object, the cause of its effect. It's a kind of literal suspended non sequitur, a scan of arrest. In this scansion, intention meets its rival, indecision, and often its evil twin, impatience. This talk will proceed in that space. You okay so far? Still awake? It's only page 2. The severance of a subject from its object brings horrifically to mind recent acts of another kind of severance, that of a person's head from his body by the sweep of a massive blade held by a hooded figure. I interject this image here because it resonates differently from whatever discursive continuities I might suggest in this talk, where the forms of intention and meaning circulate through a finite realm of poetics and aesthetics, removed from the deliberate acts of violence of which we are now being made constantly aware. I suppose I want to consider if these realms of human intentionality, the making of artworks, in some way fold out or reverberate or indicate, at the very least complicate what it means for bodies to be severed from heads within the agonized terrain of contemporary life. The abject discontinuity or rupture implicated by the symbolic power of these acts, acts of deliberate abuse and terror, arouses in me a sorrowing despair and shame, as if they made literal the failure of the Judeo-Christian epoch, as if all of our efforts to understand the links between our mental, sentient, conscious, imaginative, civic lives and our sensual, affective, spiritual, creative lives had come to naught, were in fact meaningless, empty, and void, as if all our institutions, our constitutions and laws, and the ideas they promulgate had failed. In Human Universe, Charles Olson wrote, "The meeting of man and the world is also his cutting edge. If man is active, it is exactly here where experience comes in that it is delivered back. And if he stays fresh, at the coming in, he will be fresh at the going out. If he does not, all that he does inside his house is stale. As more and more stale, he is less and less acute at the door. Two, 1950, 1994. As many of you know, in 1950, Charles Olson published a manifesto, Projective Verse, in which he sets out the main elements of his poetics, which he called composition by field. It is here that he uses the phrase credited to Robert Creeley, "Form is never more than an extension of content." Creeley-Olson's pithy mantra has had a remarkable staying power. It gives the aspiring poet a kind of sense that form is part of a fluid connection, an extension of whatever it is she is writing. I've always had a problem with this word, extension, as if there were a cord, some physical thing that connects a given content to its form. Indeed, for Olson, this physical thing, this extension cord, was composed of the ear and the eye and the rhythms of the breath as they embodied the sensate workings of mind and heart. Composition by field was an intuitive skill, finally, far from the technical demands of closed forms. For many years, I have made a diagram. The diagram, amazingly, some of you have seen this diagram because I've made it so many times, but actually, I made a really nice drawing of this diagram for us, but I left it in the hotel room. So, speak Freud and forever hold your peace. For many years, I have made a diagram in which I have tried to inscribe my own sense of the way subject matter, form, and meaning are related. I prefer the retro, if banal, phrase subject matter to content because it allows for both a subject and a matter. What matters to the subject, where the subject is the writer or artist, and the matter his, her arena of interest or care, as well as all that she has, her DNA, her grandmother's eyes, the books on her shelves. This diagram has appeared on innumerable scraps of paper, napkins, notebooks, blackboards. It was first iterated at Bart in 1994 after I had visited the studio of a painter during her third and final summer. I looked at her paintings. They were large, colorful, immensely accomplished abstractions, although she had made a series of small portraits which she had rejected. And I think I asked her after some time, "What do these paintings mean to you? And then, what are they about?" I was astonished when, after a few moments of silence, she burst into tears. The tears, we might say, of Eros. After I left her studio, I began to cogitate on why my questions had been so disturbing. I thought about how the discourse around painting, and to an extent around the other 5 disciplines we engage in the Bart MFA, elided the whole issue of subject matter, subjectivity. Our critical discourse was dominated by formal terms, techne, much of it spiced with theory, reference to significant contemporary critical thinkers. It was the middle of October's second decade, Krauss, Buchloh, Jameson, Foster, and the great dark trio, Bart, Baudrillard, Debord. We had, I then thought, however inadvertently, suppressed the tissue of connection, the ligaments between the maker of objects and the object she, he, they made. Indeed, as many of you know, there had been around this time in certain avant-garde poetic circles a veritable fatwa against the first-person singular, consigning the I to the dust heap of lyricism. Claudia Rankine and Juliana Spar had organized a conference of women poets at Barnard around the rubric where lyric meets language, language referring here to language poetry, only there wasn't a meeting, there was an abyss. The poetic eye was contaminated, drawing to itself the exhausted diction of expressive sensibility. And I could not formulate the necessary engagement with linguistic structures that would, in Ron Silliman's phrase, change the world. The Rilkean moment was over. No need to change your life, change the world. What are those lines from Eliot's East Coker? In my beginning is my end, in succession houses fall, rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place. It is an open field or a factory or a bypass. 3. (1946 and 1968). It's very historical, right? That's what happens. On the last day of 1946, President Truman declared the official end of the Second World War. That previous summer, W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley had published in the Sewanee Review The Intentional Fallacy, which according to the authors, quote, is a confusion between the poem and its origins, a special case of what is known to philosophers as the genetic fallacy. It begins by trying to derive the standard of criticism from the psychological causes of the poem and ends in biography and relativism. End quote. The same two authors went on to write the affective fallacy, which in turn is, quote, a confusion between the poem and its results, what it is and what it does, a special case of epistemological skepticism. It begins by trying to derive the standard of criticism from the psychological effects of the poem and ends in impressionism and relativism. So demon relativism is sort of fascinating to me, because I want to know whether it's related to indeterminacy. Both of these fallacies, according to Wimsatt and Beardsley, result in what they call the poem itself disappearing. This set of prescriptions came to be called the New Criticism. Its idea was that poems were freestanding objects, and the critical job was to treat them like verbal puzzles with somewhat intricate parts, and to describe how those parts worked. Let's consider another year, 1968. The war in Vietnam is in progress, and the Tet Offensive begins at the end of January. Nixon enters the presidential race. Martin Luther King delivers the sermon in which he invokes his own death day. I'd like for somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major for peace, for righteousness. In March, Robert Kennedy announces he will run for president. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot and killed. There are riots in major cities around the country. There is a rally against the war in April at Columbia University, which ends with students occupying 5 buildings. In May, peace talks are planned in Paris between the U.S. and the North Vietnamese. May 6th comes to be called Bloody Monday, in which 5,000 students march through the Latin Quarter in Paris. May 22nd, as many as 9 million workers are on strike in France, and de Gaulle takes actions which undermine the force of the insurgency. In June, Andy Warhol is shot. In June, Robert Kennedy is shot and killed. 27th of June, Prague Spring continues in Czechoslovakia. By November, Richard Nixon is elected over Humphrey, and Lyndon Johnson has announced the end to bombing in Vietnam. I know, you could just look on the wiki page still. In 1968, I was living in London, a young expatriate American woman aspiring to become a poet. In 1968 or thereabouts, somewhere in Paris, the less young literary theorist and semiotician Roland Bart was writing The Death of the Author, a short essay in which he disavows the author's person as being instrumental in informing the meaning of writing. Rather, he claims the text is an instance of pure presence, a here and a now, a performative in which the author is never more, quote, never more than the instance writing, just as I is nothing other than the saying I. Language knows a subject, not a person, and this subject, empty outside of the very enunciation which defines it, suffices to make language hold together, suffices, that is to say, to exhaust it. For Bart, following structuralist doxa, the new modern writer or scriptor is the hand cut off from any voice, born by a pure gesture of inscription and not of expression that traces a field without origin, in which at least, which at least has no other origin than language itself, language which ceaselessly calls into question all origins. End quote. So language is a river without a source, carrying along the detritus of its own passage, a system of remnant traces. For Bart at this moment, all the worlds of text and all its objects are encoded with secret mythological import. The question, who is speaking, seems to have fallen away, leaving behind only the emanation of a disembodied or detached hand that writes, a kind of machine, we might say, without memory, relations, friends, mothers, or lovers, without either temporal or spatial coordinates, without any intentionality other than to enter the great language stream. This hand has no gender and no color. It has no identity. If Bart wrote this essay in 1968, it was indeed the year in which the very idea of authority was being contested and dismantled variously, not only in Paris, but in innumerable places and around a variety of subject positions. Perhaps this contextual historical frame is too obvious, too simplistic to even count. But these many years later, we might consider that the idea of stripping the world of the authority of authorship would have felt like liberation, only partly indebted to semiological and structuralist codes, to Philippe Solar's and the little magazine Tel Quel, or to the remnants of new critical doctrine. So why did the little essay, The Death of the Author, gain such immense traction in the intellectual imaginary, if I may so phrase it, that it nearly slipped from being an extreme metaphor to an active fact? Is this a dull, specious question that has been asked in 100 PhD theses archived in the cloud? I suppose. I'm just now belatedly thinking about the death of the author as coming along at an historical moment of extreme contestation. And it wasn't much later that the Academy began to mandate the necessity of alterity, of including authors whose works and worlds had been marginalized or otherwise disincluded. If the author, epitome of the idea of the individual, the self in Western society, were declared dead and the text lived on, then perhaps a political liberation of the disenfranchised might ensue. Intentionality moves across a terrain of multiple registers of meaning. Contexts alter our relation to both. You still okay? All right. There's no plot, is there? What's her plot? Somebody's stretching. You all want to stretch? I'm on page 7. There are 103. For meaning and Humpty Dumpty. I was recently reading a book by Seth Lloyd, a quantum computer scientist, called Programming the Universe, published in 2007. I know it seems unlikely, but desperation makes strange bedfellows. In his chapter called Computation, Lloyd has a section called Meaning. He likes to frame his discussion with conversations from either real or hypothetical students in his classes at MIT. But doesn't information have to mean something? Asked a student, troubled. You're right, that when we think of information, we normally associate it with meaning, I answered. But the meaning of meaning is not clear. I was happy to read that sentence, since I had been wondering about the meaning of meaning for a long time, and it was reassuring that a computer scientist could make my doubts into a declarative sentence. Lloyd continues, for thousands of years, philosophers have tried to determine what meaning means with mixed success. The reason it is so hard to pin down is that the meaning of a piece of information depends very much on how that information is to be interpreted. If you don't know how a message is to be interpreted, then you don't know its meaning. For example, if I say to you, yes, when you haven't asked a question, then you don't know what I mean by yes. If you ask, can I have a piece of cake? And I say yes, then you know what I mean. He goes on in this vein for a while and then says, meaning is defined only relative to a scheme of interpretation. And to make this point, he quotes from the great Lewis Carroll, aka the nominalist philosopher Charles Dodgson, a passage from a conversation between Alice and Humpty Dumpty, in which Humpty Dumpty claims, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. We all know what happened to Humpty Dumpty. 5. Matisse and the Reinvention of Intention. I was reading in the London Review of Books sometime last summer or fall, or a review of Matisse cutouts, then on view at Tate by T.J. Clark. Since Matisse is the artist whose work first set me on the journey of the various discoveries and insights provided by visual work, most particularly 2 paintings, The Red Studio and The Music Lesson, which I first saw as a girl at MoMA, I am interested in what is written about him, and I have a separate admiration for Clark's articulations of his own lively engagement with art. Clark begins his meditation on the cutouts with a quotation from Roland Bart, who may turn out to be the anti-hero of my talk today, in which there is the following sentence, it is the shudder of meaning I interrogate, listening to the rustle of language, which for me, modern man, is my nature. Nature is capitalized. Whatever else this painting may be, Clark writes, it is not a sensation delivery system. It knows that sensation belongs to, or alas, have been detached from, sensations belong to, or alas, have been detached from particular human occasions, ways of being, forms of life. But the exacerbation of color in Matisse speaks dialectically to the lack of particularity that makes us modern. Color for Matisse, pure sensation, the stuff of the senses, will be a form of life. And at the same time, it will enact the extremity, the uncanniness of the wish. And then in parenthesis, this to and fro of contraries is dealt with powerfully in a new book by Todd Cronin, Against Affective Formalism, Matisse, Bergson, Modernism. What does it mean to say that color will enact the extremity of the wish? And how does wishing relate to intending? If I wish something, then I am projecting into a futurity that is coming toward me. If I intend something, I am projecting from myself into the future, which I want in some way to shape. So both wish and intent are engaged in the imagining of what will or might be. The intent is from the subject side, the wish is from the object side of the temporal coin. When artists are making a work, are they entering the relation between an intent and a wish? Are they opening up a space between what was, what is, and what will be that somehow collapses the ordeal of sequence into the apprehension of a singularity in which all the tenses are simultaneously present? The book Clark mentions by Todd Cronin is finely calibrated and densely written. It's on the academic stage. At its core is the issue of representation, not in the literal sense of mimesis or likeness, but rather one that informed so much early modernist work, particularly the Russian constructivists, around the distinction between art and world. Cronin writes, "Representation, in my account, defines the ontological difference between the work of art and the world outside it. The effort to break down or eliminate that distinction between work and world is the subject of my history. This is crucial because once the work of art loses its art status and becomes like an object, it also becomes available to beholder response in a way that any object does. And one does not bring intentions to bear on the experience of objects in the way one does with artworks. One could argue that one does bring intentions to bear on objects if we decide that their intentions can be equated with their use. We might think about a chair as having the intention of being comfortable, for example. But in doing that, we have simply displaced the designer onto her design. We might move the question from objects to nature, and here the question of intentionality is generally not asked. Nature has no intentions, even if what happens as a result of natural phenomena does frequently have consequences. Still, the Greeks invented a pantheon to transform natural events into acts of willed intention." Cronin's discussion of representation begins with articulating the distinction between objective observation and subjective immersion, between, as he puts it, seeing and seeing oneself. Quotes, "One cannot both fully act and watch oneself at the same time." He perceives both Matisse and Bergson as caught up in this duality. He quotes Matisse, quote, "An artist must realize when he is reasoning that his picture is an artifice, but when he paints he must have the feeling that he has copied nature. To give yourself completely to what you're doing while simultaneously watching yourself do it. An artist is an explorer. He should begin by seeking himself, seeing himself act, then he should not restrain himself." Cronin is not arguing for an intimacy with the artist. His biography, psychology, statements about art, and so on, nor does he want to tie his view of intentionality to evaluation or aesthetic judgment. His view is that intentions make works of art different from other objects in the world because intentions do not figure. Objects in the world where intentions do not figure. Intentions do not necessarily align themselves to outcomes. Indeed, intentions are not always conscious, as Freud points out. He adds, to say that an artist did not know what a work meant until he made it is not to say that it was unintended, but it was something he could not articulate at the level of intellectual control. This phrase is Duchamp's. If the artist could articulate at the level of intellectual control, it is hard to see why he or she would make art to begin with. What Cronin suggests is that when we come to interpret a work of art, to articulate to ourselves or to others what meaning or meanings it has for us, we are aware at some level that it was intended, that it is the result of a play of intentional gestures that are evidence of the very motion between unconscious and conscious acts, and that these gestures move the insularity and solitude of the individual into the communal, into what Jacques Rancière has called the distribution of the sensible. 6. Checking on you. Rancière and bodies in shared space. I read Rancière because he seems to be rethinking the cacophony of critical theories that, instead of advancing the ambitions and hopes of the avant-garde and the cohort of political activists, seems to have led in recent years, rethinking the cacophony of critical theories that, seem to have led in recent years to a sense of being stymied, caught in a cage of discourse from which there appears to be no escape except into another room of worker bees in the hive of academe. Rancière characteristically moves chronologically backwards in order to come forward, reconditioning or revisiting the conditions that have led to now. He thinks about what modernism was in ways that renovate some of our received notions of what postmodernism is. He thinks about aesthetics and politics. From what I can tell, he wants to find a way to mend the rip between ideas of community, often his word for politics, and the idea of artistic life, the life of art, and the life of artists. This is really about performance, you understand? I'm getting there very slowly, but you're getting the point that this is performance. It's all about the paper. For Rancière, it isn't the author who is dead, but rather the conditions in which the living author or artist might be included in the activities of what he calls bodies in shared space. In Aesthetic Separation, Aesthetic Community, a chapter in his 2008 book, The Emancipated Spectator, he writes, "Many contemporary artists no longer set out to create works of art. Instead, they want to get out of the museum and induce alterations of the space of everyday life, generating new forms of relation." He goes on to describe a project in the outskirts of Paris, urban encampment, which would be, quotes, dedicated to a specific end, solitude, meaning that it would be conceived and established as a place that could only be occupied by one person at a time for the purposes of solitary contemplation or meditation. That is why the project was called I and Us. He then comments, "So being together apart appears to be more than a form of poetic sophistication. Constructing a place for solitude, an aesthetic place, appears to be a task for committed art. The possibility of being apart appears to be precisely the dimension of social life which is rendered impossible by ordinary life in Parisian suburbs." This is radically counterintuitive. The way to ease the tense despair of the Paris suburbs, standing in for many tense despairs in many other places, is not to bring persons together, but to provide them with a place for solitude. This is not the poetic solitude of the lyric I. Rather, it might be a place for the inception of an epic journey, a sense of heroic return, where lyric affirmation is reinvented as, quotes, "the fiction of a return journey, return to the origin of meaning, to the place where metaphoric transport is reinsured against the usury and betrayal of words, where liberty is recognized as the living principle of every relation, of every deed that gathers words and things." This last quote is taken from Rancière's writing about Byron against Wordsworth. The body in space, so he's saying that this, in this other, when he's talking about Wordsworth and then Byron, he invokes this sort of extraordinary, he has a beautiful, wonderful whole discourse on Wordsworth and Wordsworth's wandering and the privilege of the wanderer. And then he sort of turns to Byron and he speaks about Byron's kind of destructive, his reinvention of a kind of Homeric idea of the epic. And there's something very, very powerful in this shift space that he describes. So I've just given you a little tiny piece of it. The body in space is a trope that recurs frequently in contemporary art, as you know, with the new vitality of performance work and with a general emphasis on physical presence, most succinctly denoted by the word occupy. To reattach the hand to the body and to place the body in real space, a step away from delivering the human over to the technological and toward reaffirming our place among creatures in the world. Once so mended, we might allow certain basic questions to be asked, questions less about our separate identities and individualities and more about our reciprocities between and among, through and across the communal sites of gathering. Monsieur's phrase, the distribution of the sensible, captures a sense of the need for the singular and plural to occupy our perceptual understanding, which, as he says, establishes at one and at the same time something common that is shared and has exclusive parts. In addition, is attention to performative, interactive practices in the arts a general critique of individuality, as well as an expression of a need for community, where personhood or selfhood is understood as a privileged value, Emersonian self-reliance as the godchild of protected childhoods and educated, class-marked genealogies? It's not exactly rhetorical, this question. The crisis is surely upon us. The space between the individual and the community is attenuated. The role of the artist in this attenuation asks questions about intentionality in relation to the social. Classically, artworks are specific, one might say unique, forms of meaning-making. Their specificity has to do with the doubling of the site of interpretation, artist in the first place, viewer, spectator, reader in the second. If materials and processes, let's say a piece of wood and a whittling knife, constitute raw information, data, then what someone does with a knife to the piece of wood, carves it into a bird, for example, or into an abstract arabesque, these are interpretive acts, acts of translation, wood into bird. But they are still short of meaning. It seems that meaning is found when someone comes into contact with the carved wooden bird, the poem, the video, the composition of sounds. So this is what the critic does, finds her meaning and articulates it. But is this meaning freely found without either the knowledge of the artist or the critic's set of interests and engagements? Read Hilton All's essay on Robert Gober's show, where the experiential frames, temporal and cultural, of both artist and critic are cited as necessary to our understanding of the works. Read Dave Hickey's review of the earlier Gober Dia show, in which Hickey's personal bearings come to press on how he sees and what he says about Gober. Meaning connects certain persons to other persons, certain times to other times, geographies to other geographies, through acts of what to call it, interpretive response. This is what we have come to more or less agree to, that in this passive agreement, we have quietly voided the idea that the person who made the wooden bird intended something beyond mimesis, and in this erasure we have limited intention to consciousness. I'm almost done. 7, the inner and the outer. My work as a poet is often described as difficult, and this is usually a way to move away rather than toward its possible meanings. I often want to ask if these critics think I intended my work to be difficult, if in fact I set out to make this difficulty evident, even a value. I sit down and I say to myself, today I will write a difficult poem. I wish they would ask if this difficulty is in the service of something, a way of encountering the world through language, the language of the poem that speaks through the difficult, collapsed spaces between events so that causal relations are possibly obscured, opacities that hinder a way through or a way out into clear meaning, fragments that hang in space, waiting for connective tissues, intrusions from outside of the poem's ostensible field of interest that rupture or confound, and so forth. These kinds of so-called difficulties are intentional. There is much about the world and about life that I do not understand, much more that I do not know. These poems are in part evidence of these partial, incomplete, and sometimes overtly obstructed sites of meaning. I cannot equate meaning with sense. What I have come to understand and maybe even to know is that having decided to become a writer of poems, I have discovered that I am the result of them as much as they are the result of me. I am the object of their subject. The dialectic between the maker and the made is one that oscillates between every work we make, because every work we make tells us something we did not know about our relation to the world outside and the world within before we made it. Persons who read or view a work of art are in some sense given access to this coming into knowledge. I believe that works of art allow readers and spectators to witness the intimacy of the relation between materials and choices in the creation of objects, and that this witnessing in turn by analogy endows those persons with an awareness of their capacity to make choices in so-called real life. Artworks embodying a very specific form of intentionality are invitations to agency. Artworks, because they engage intentional capacities, that is, our ability to choose between acts in the service of making things that have no instrumental use, but do elicit our desire to make meaning, are paradigmatic examples of how humans become conscious of their acts, that is, their choices and their consequences. The way we construct our sense of meaning is related to our consciousness of these choices, these intentions. Works tell us something not about the artist, but about her or his habits of mind. And these, in turn, offer something like an objective familiarity, a way for what is fundamentally strange, not you, not yours, to become known. A work offers a kind of intimacy which splits or pivots, pointing back to the artist and out to the world. William Kendrick begins his Norton lectures from 2012 called 6 Drawing Lessons with the parable of Plato's cave, where, as you know, prisoners are kept unable to move their heads, unable to see the light. For them, the shadows thrown up on the walls of the cave constitute reality. Plato then proposes that one prisoner escapes from the cave and discovers that, in fact, the real world is not one of shadows, but of objects, flora and fauna, the stars and the moon and the sun, a bird, a daisy, a blade of grass. Kendrick uses Plato as a way to stage his own inquiries as an artist giving a lecture at Harvard. He quotes the passage from The Republic that announces the ethical imperative of the person who has escaped the fantastic illusion of the cave to liberate or emancipate those left behind in darkness and shadows. This chapter is called In Praise of Shadows. Intention is a poor partner to meaning. Try as they may, they will never last as a couple, not even through this talk. Intention is far from the actual fabric of intention is too far from the actual fabric of desire and the ways in which desire threads itself into whatever one is fabricating, poem, painting, film, dance. Desire's needle pierces through the skin of intent and touches the messy abridgments and occlusions that inform any endeavor of someone to make something. And this same needle pierces the critic as well, activating her interior stuff and potentially rearranging it, bringing bits to light and changing orders, premises, preferences. Maybe we can't allow ourselves to expunge these sources of so-called irrationality from our eventual understanding of what a given work of art means, even if we cannot either know, access, or name them. Those layers which the psyche or soul carries along and which are given permission to reside, the traces of dream work, the vicissitudes of memory, the fragments of knowledge and experience, must somehow be given presence, even if it is one of mystery, if we are to allow artworks to be more than overt playthings, investments, decor, signage, as Cronin has it, mere objects among other objects. I'm not suggesting that we need to know about an artist's personal stuff in order to engage her work, but I do think we need to credit the materials, so to speak, which are given to a single subject in a specific environment, a time and a place. These contextual framings allow us to ask the question, what do you mean? Where the emphasis falls on the you. What do you mean? This is how we might resist the tendency of technology to make each of us a unit or component speaking into and from a vaguely imagined universality, a sample, where the particulars of temporal immediacy and spatial setting are either effaced or turned into spectacle. I am not an image of myself. I have a fantasy that language or writing will come ineluctably, and in such a manner that each instance of its appearance will somehow both match and escape my intent, so that I'm in a state of absolute attention, like a person on a high wire, able to elicit every fiber of concentration from the exquisite and odd relation between wire and surrounding air. I intend to get from one side to the other, but the process cannot be reduced to skill because there are so many unknowns, variables that simultaneously fetter and unfetter the way. I'm not entirely happy with this analogy of the high wire. I thought it would suffice because language is a kind of tightrope moving in its lateral way, pausing, looking up and down, aware of the situation, the faces in the crowd, the temperature of the air, the run in the stocking. But even as we are making our way from one side of the sentence to the other, no one is watching, and the immediacy of the hour, the prior hour, the chair, the pain in the foot, thirst, worry, all the tasks put aside for the sake of the crossing, these do not enter into the intentional space that the sentence completes. Thank you. Yes?
Well, since you're dealing in threads, I'll just throw a thread out there, and if you want to pursue it or not, it's up to you. I was just thinking of the open text, that whole notion of openness to the reading of a piece. And I'm just wondering where you go with that in terms of, you mentioned this interest, you were starting to touch on indeterminacy and relativism. So I'm just wondering where do you go with that in terms of the open reading of work?
I'm not sure I know what it means to have an open reading of a work. I'm not sure what that indicates. I mean, I like the phrase. If you mean untethered, I don't think, there's that thing that Bart says there, there's something about the shudder of language. I like that. I like the idea that it's not rigid, and that it sort of moves inside of itself, and therefore that the way in which you might comprehend something will change, and actually does change. You can read a book, one point in your life and read it again at another point, and you'll have a different experience of the book because you've changed. So all of that's a kind of open reading, I suppose. I mean, I think we agree, all of us here or everywhere. I mean, anybody who's thought about this stuff at all knows that there isn't any set, correct way of thinking about writing in general, and certainly not works of literature. There isn't any right way there are no right answers. But there are very insightful kinds of readings, so it isn't like everybody has an equally valid way of saying what something means. Some people are better at it, or think more, or have more in their interior to bring to the space of the reading. And so when one talks about the act of reading, one's talking about all of the things that we think about in terms of artworks, so the read is everywhere, you know, you read everything. That's one of the things that Roland Bart taught us. And it was a great teaching, because I think it's true. I mean, for me it's true. I don't think it's true in any absolute way, but I think it's very, very useful to understand that that's what we do. We read the world. That's a sort of not very satisfactory. Relativism, I just was very surprised to see that word twice, and I didn't quite know why relativism was such a bogey, or kind of, you know, like a bad thing at that moment. And it interests me because, of course, relativity was certainly something people knew about. So there must have been some kind of fundamental threat that came out of Einstein, maybe, that it meant that you couldn't ever know exactly what some, you know, text meant, and these guys were really anxious about that. But it was fascinating that the new critics really, and Bart clearly, you know, was very similar in a way. This idea of the freestanding text, you know, that came from no one. Such a bizarre, odd kind of way of thinking. Disingenuous. It was there. He did it. This was for a point, clearly. And of course, he goes on so wonderfully to find his way to the great idea of the neutral. So it was a passage he was making. Do you have a question? Come on, have a question. Yes?
Why did you make that analogy between Bart and the New Critics? Because when you came to the New Critics and I suddenly thought, oh my God, that sounds like Bart, and I'd never heard that. I mean, Bart obviously goes through a lot of changes, whereas New Criticism is kind of fixed in time in our minds.
I don't know, I just suddenly realized that one is so fascinating, right? Because then you have a kind of figure of enormous, who enters, you know, the intellectual imagined fully, and that's Roland Bart at this moment, right? With the book, which of course there are these delayed spaces of translation, but I think that essay was written in, if it's not 68, it was written in 67, but right around there. So that in itself seems really useful to me, to realize that it was engaged in a political space that was very real. And the relation to the New Critics, I think actually that was something that he would know about. You know, he would know about that. But the difference between the reception of these two ideas is so huge, right? Because the New Critics then become absolutely dismissed, you know, and so that's just very interesting about fashion in a way, you know, intellectual fashion is involved in that. And also the ways in which they put it in the Sewanee Review were so sort of boring, and Bart's is so thrilling to read, you know. I mean, it was just so interesting. So that's also part of it, I think.
Well, is the fact that also he's French, and so it's a whole body of water away?
Well, that's a whole other discussion, and somebody, I'm sure, at some point, if not already, will write a wonderful book about the infatuation of Americans with all things not American, and our disdain for pretty much everything that we make here, in terms of the critical thinking anyway. I mean, it's just sort of extraordinary to me, with some notable exceptions, of course. But as you know, I go on and on about the fact that, you know, William James is probably as interesting a philosopher as Deleuze, and nobody reads William James. Everybody thinks he's, you know, from some other planet.
Yeah.
Or Whitehead, for that matter, another philosopher that, you know, nobody reads. Everyone reads. I just read somewhere it's an introduction to, what's her name? Isabel Signor, is that her name? Signor, it's S-E-G-N, she's Belgian, she's a philosopher. She's written a huge book called Thinking with Whitehead. And there's an introduction by Bruno Latour, and his first sentence is, who's the most important philosopher of the 20th century whose name starts with W? And then he says, yeah, you all think it's Wittgenstein, but you're wrong. It's Whitehead. It was a very good way to start.
That's interesting because you talk about Bart and Rancière. Do you think that there's maybe something to do with somebody from another culture appreciating this woman's Belgian and she's writing Latin?
What? Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think, you can't not be aware in the last part of the 20th century anyway of this astonishing parade of philosophical thinkers who have, in France mostly, who gave us ways to think about the world that nobody else was doing. So I mean, I don't know why this is true, other than education and a tradition and all the rest of it. But I think that there's a reason why we go and read them, because they do give us a way to think about things that are very hard to think about. And in that thinking, they make offerings to us, ways of trying to find our way. I mean, obviously, you probably could tell from this talk that I read for that reason. I read totally to try and get to find an instruction. And the reason I'm drawn to thinkers is because I think I will find, some kind of way of thinking that helps. So it's not for any other reason. It's like a kind of, it's a kind of. And it isn't about authority either. I mean, I think it's not because I think they're important, or I think they're useful, or I think they could become useful to me personally.
Well, except that in the end of your talk, you come back to E.M. Foster, how can I know what I think until I see what I say, in some way, except for that you're layering now more responsibility onto that, more intention at the beginning. It's now a thicker, richer statement, but you've gone very far afield, and I think you could have written that last paragraph 20 years ago, and you would have looked at it and thought, yes, that's true, without having to know all the other things, or do you think not? That would make it 1994.
Well, I know there's something very interesting about that question, because I think part of the argument that I'm making in this, if you could even call it an argument, but part of the ground of test or push has to do with that question, whether having gone through those, 15 pages, and I come back to this place of, wait to see what is going to be said by writing it, whether that idea, it's the same idea, but has it altered the way in which one hears it, or one says it, or one thinks it. That seems to me to be really useful, really interesting to ask that question. It's also interesting because in one of my earlier drafts of this draft-D piece, the quotations from the beginning I put at the end. And then I thought, no, they are really like, sort of like places of contact, they're kind of like little dots of an outline almost of the thing. I meant to bring both the diagram that I've made so many times, I left it in the hotel room, and the etymology of both the word intent and meaning, but alas, they stayed in the hotel. Yes?
So one of the more, hopeful moments I think of resolving the many sort of rifts that you're pointing to in the pieces seems to be in your description of Francière, which I really, really appreciated how you framed his work, and think that there you were finding something like the way of bridging the individual to the community, or in some way the I to a system of thought that has replaced the I, by looking at how he sees agency in building community.
Right.
And thinking about that, I also was thinking about a moment that you saw as sort of failing to do that, even though it attempted to, with this moment in 1994, once again, 20 years ago, where you mentioned two poets, Juliana Spar and Claudia Rankine, attempting to make a conference around the meaning of lyric and language, not as a tension that could never be resolved, but as something that might be a productive tension.
Right.
And you mentioned that rather than amending, there was a kind of abyss. So I also was thinking about those 20 years and whether you might think about 1994 and 2014 there, because Claudia Rankine has just published an immensely popular and also outstanding book called Citizen, an American Lyric, which I'm sure you've read and experienced so far. And at a moment that a large social movement has emerged around questions of the personal and the political as they relate to race in this country, and how personal racism might relate to structural racism. It's a book that is focusing on racist microaggressions, scenes of everyday life, and addressing those bigger questions. So I just wonder if you would speak to whether maybe lyric and language, or that kind of community and individual rift, also might be reappearing in a more resolved or optimistic moment through works like that.
What an elegant question. I think you're asking me whether I think that the landscape is different from the way it was, right? And of course, there's no way for it not to be different, because it is 20 years later. And I think if you're talking about poetry or poetics in specifically, I think the sense that one had then, that you really had to be on a side, that there were really strong understandings that what was important and what wasn't important. So that was where that divide was. And it was fueled by critical reception, hugely by a kind of a system of competition. So I think that has changed. I think that sense of that poetry is some kind of competitive sport, or a fashion, even more like fashion. Like this is the new fashion. You better get with it and do this, or else you'll be excluded. I think that's gone away a lot. I don't think it's gone away entirely, and I think that each generation has to sort that out again and again and again, whatever it is, in whichever way it asserts itself. I think that these kinds of cultural, social tensions, especially in America, seem to have cycles, you know, they go away and people think, oh, it's much better now and everything is, you know, we've kind of solved that problem, we have a black president and all like that. And then the wheel turns and then it comes back up in a different guise almost. It's the same set of issues, but it's changed its, you know, its way of being. And I think that happens in poetry too, that the cycles come back and people are anxious about belonging. I mean, I think there's some kind of very central little piece in there, you know, which is that poetry particularly is so vulnerable in the culture that you want to feel that you belong to something that signifies, you know, that people care about, you know, like Claudia's book, you know, wow, you know, suddenly all of this attention, or, you know, Ben Lerner's, you know, novel that. And part of that is disturbing because what happens there is that you pick out the one figure, and the one figure then becomes the sign of this whatever. Everybody wants a piece of her. That's the star system, right? But the things that surround, you know, her amazing book, Citizen, you know, I don't think it's the greatest book I've ever read, but it's an important book to have happened just now, right? But other people have written some pretty amazing books about the same thing, and they're not getting any attention. So on and on and on. So it's always in a kind of some kind of. There's no steadying of it. There's no sort of saying, yes, the times are much better now than they were. That particular engagement was horrible, and many people were wounded by it permanently, myself included. So, you know, hopefully that's not happening. I hope people are not getting really hurt because they're not doing what everybody else thinks they ought to be doing. Because what happens in that, which I think is really important to think about, again goes back to intentionality in a way, which is, what if you didn't want to do that? What if you decided you didn't want to do that? You weren't going to do that. You were going to do this other thing. You know, this less chic thing. You made that choice. It wasn't that you were somehow just, you know, in your vagary, and so those things are discredited. The reasons why people aren't doing what people think they ought to be doing, or sometimes it's always assumed that you're either out of it or ignorant of it, or something like that, and that's not really the case. You know, people do what they do for many, many reasons. And to do things, as everyone knows, to do things because you think it's the thing to do, it does not make a good artist, usually. Usually it's a really failed strategy. Very pretty clothes might come out of it, though, to switch the metaphor. Although I did look at the dresses that everybody was wearing at the Grammys the other night, and I thought, no, this can't be. This just can't be. That's right. That's it.